My name is Amanda, and I was 27. That night, my father lounged at my kitchen table, smirking. I found the 25,000 in your safe, he said. I spent it on Claire's wedding. Consider it a gift from you. My stomach knotted, heat rising in my chest. I clenched my jaw so tight it ached. Every instinct screamed to explode. But my voice came out flat. Understood. 2 minutes later, Grandpa walked in. Son, where's the money I gave you to keep? Dad went pale. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't some rich socialite hiding money for fun. I was a licensed electrician, 27, with calloused hands. Long shifts, crawling through attics, rewiring basements. Overtime every single week. The apartment I rented wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. 2 bedrooms, 1 for sleeping, 1 for tools and storage. I didn't travel, didn't splurge, didn't chase Instagram dreams. Every extra dollar went into that safe in my closet. Not because I didn't trust banks, but because I didn't trust my family. See, in my house, family helps family wasn't love. It was a one-way obligation shoved down my throat. Dad broke his truck, Amanda pays. Mom had medical bills, Amanda covers. Claire wanted to launch a candle business, Amanda funds the inventory. They never asked nicely. It was always guilt, always pressure, always the unspoken rule. You owe us, we gave you life. That was Dad's favorite line. By 20, I'd learned not to keep savings where they could see. A bank balance was an invitation for Dad to borrow. So I went old school. Cash, tucked away, brick by brick. That 25 grand wasn't luxury. It was my parachute, my emergency exit. It was proof I could build something they couldn't take. But here's the part that always cut the deepest. Claire was the princess. Sweet, fragile, pampered. And I was the background noise. Her problems became center stage. My achievements? Ignored, dismissed, or mocked as masculine. When she cried, the family rallied. When I bled, they looked the other way. Every time I thought I was finally ahead, something urgent dragged me down. Overtime checks gone, side jobs erased, savings drained. And the worst part? They acted like it was natural, like that was my role. The provider. The fixer. The invisible daughter with deep pockets. So when Dad sat there smirking, calling it a gift, it wasn't just theft. It was confirmation of every insult, every dismissal, every manipulation. To him, my years of sweat weren't mine. They were just family resources, waiting to be redirected. I thought locking my savings in a safe would protect me. I thought boundaries meant safety. I was wrong. Claire's wedding had been doomed from the start. Not the marriage, not the love story, the budget. She wanted the kind of day you see in glossy magazines. Waterfront venue, imported flowers. A live band that charged more than my annual rent. $60,000 easy. Her fiancé worked part-time at a sporting goods store. Claire worked at a boutique, more interested in Instagram posts than paychecks. But every time they hit a wall, Dad swooped in. Don't worry, we'll make it work, he'd say. Translation: Amanda will make it work. I kept quiet, biting my tongue until it bled. Because I knew the pattern. Family emergency, Amanda's savings. But this time, the numbers didn't add up. Even if Dad sold his boat, even if Mom took out a loan, they still couldn't cover Claire's champagne dreams. So where was the money coming from? I had a sick feeling I already knew. That safe in my closet. The one place I thought was untouchable. Dad had been in my apartment before. Fixing the window, he said once. Dropping off groceries another time. Always with some casual excuse to let himself in. I should have known. For months, I tried convincing myself I was paranoid. No way he'd actually crossed that line. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen him bend rules my whole life, always justifying it with family helps family. And Claire? She never asked where the money came from. She didn't care. As long as the flowers arrived and the venue sparkled, she was happy to stay blind. I worked double shifts that summer, sweating through heavy gloves, pulling wire until my arms ached. Each paycheck was supposed to inch me closer to independence. Instead, I felt the walls closing in. Like no matter how hard I worked, my family would always find a way to drain me dry. But there was one factor they hadn't accounted for. Grandpa, my dad's father, old school, sharp-eyed, a man who built everything he had from nothing. He valued honesty more than comfort. I'd seen him cut ties over $500 and a lie. The man didn't bluff. A few months earlier, Grandpa had sold a piece of land. He gave Dad 25 grand in cash to hold temporarily. Said he didn't trust banks while sorting out estate papers. I hadn't known that detail until the day Grandpa walked into my apartment. But in hindsight, it explained everything. Dad hadn't just stolen my safety net. He'd gambled with Grandpa's trust too. He thought he could smooth it over, spin some story about family generosity, make me swallow the loss like always. What he didn't count on was Grandpa walking in at the exact wrong moment, or me finally being too tired, too raw, too done to stay silent. The second Grandpa asked about his cash and saw the way Dad froze, I knew. For once, this mess wouldn't land on me. It would land squarely on him. Grandpa didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned on his cane, eyes narrowing at my father. "Son," he said evenly, "the money I gave you, where is it?" The color drained from Dad's face. He shifted in my chair like it suddenly burned. "Dad, it's not what you think." Grandpa raised a hand. "I know exactly what I think. I gave you 25,000. Cash, counted with your signature on the note." He set a folded paper on my table, his handwriting unmistakable. My chest tightened. This wasn't just about my stolen savings anymore. This was about betrayal stacked on betrayal. Dad tried the smirk, the shrug, his old tricks. It was sitting there doing nothing. I thought I'd combine it with Amanda's for the wedding. Family helps family, right? The rage in my stomach turned molten. I'd heard that line my whole life. But this time, it wasn't me who answered. It was Grandpa. "Helps family?" His voice cracked like a whip. "You took from your daughter. You stole from me. That's not helping, that's thieving." Dad bristled. "Steal? You'd call your own son a thief?" I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. My voice didn't waver. "That's exactly what it's called. You didn't ask. You didn't offer to repay. You decided my years of sweat belonged to Claire's wedding cake." For the first time, Dad didn't look like the man in charge. He looked cornered. His eyes flicked from me to Grandpa, desperate for one of us to back down. Neither of us moved. Grandpa's jaw set. "You'll replace it. Every cent, with interest." Dad's voice rose, the old intimidation creeping back. "You can't demand that of me." "I can," Grandpa snapped. "That cash was mine. And Amanda's savings were hers. You treated both like your personal wallet. Now you'll pay it back. Or I'll make sure the whole family, and the law, knows exactly what you did." The room went silent except for Dad's ragged breathing. Mom wasn't there to shield him. Claire wasn't there to whine for sympathy. It was just the three of us. And for once, the weight wasn't on my shoulders. I folded my arms. "Let me make this clear. I want my 25 back too. I don't care if you sell your car, cancel the honeymoon, whatever. This time, I'm not carrying the loss." His glare snapped to me, hot and sharp. "Do you really want to humiliate your sister? Do you want her big day ruined because you're making a scene?" I almost laughed. "You already ruined it for me when you stole from me. The wedding isn't my problem. Getting my money back is." That was the breaking point. Dad sagged into the chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked small, like a man who'd finally realized he'd picked the wrong battle. Grandpa tapped the table once with his cane. "We're done here. You'll hear from me with details." He gave me the smallest nod, like a soldier acknowledging another. And in that moment, I felt it. For once, the fallout wasn't mine to carry. It was his. The next week, Grandpa followed through. A lawyer, his lawyer, sat at my kitchen table. He slid papers across the wood. "Repayment agreement. Principal, interest, strict deadlines. Miss one payment, and the full balance becomes due." Dad's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. "This is insane. You expect me to sign my life away?" Grandpa's cane tapped once. "No, I expect you to return what you stole." The lawyer added, "Fail to comply, and we pursue legal action." I sat across the table, arms folded. For once, I wasn't the one cornered. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. But my face stayed calm, unreadable. "You can't do this." Dad turned to me, desperate. "Amanda, do you really want to ruin your sister's wedding? Do you want her crying on her big day?" I met his eyes, steady. "You ruined it the second you took my money. Claire's happiness isn't my responsibility." His jaw clenched. "You're selfish." "Selfish," I said, "is stealing from your own daughter. This is me saying no." Grandpa's voice cut through. "Enough, sign it." Dad hesitated, then finally scribbled his name. The first time he signed something not in his favor. Word spread fast. Mom called, voice sharp. "How could you do this to your sister? You're tearing this family apart." "Dad tore it apart when he stole," I replied. "I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen." Then Claire called. "Do you want to bleed Dad dry? Walk me down the aisle knowing my own sister punished him? You want someone to blame?" I said. "Look at the man who stole from both of us. Not me." She sobbed and hung up. But the payments came. The first installment hit my account 2 weeks later, with a bitter note. "Transferred. Happy now?" I didn't reply, but I knew what it cost him. Uncle called, chuckling. "Your dad sold his boat, the one he bragged about every summer. Gone." I smiled. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because, for once, the consequence wasn't mine to carry. It was his. At gatherings, Mom glared, Claire hissed, Dad sulked. But Grandpa stood like a wall. When relatives murmured, "Amanda's too harsh," he shut it down with 5 words. "She's protecting what's hers." And that was the shift. For the first time, I wasn't the villain. For the first time, I wasn't the scapegoat. I was the daughter who drew the line. And deep inside, I knew this battle was the first time I'd truly chosen myself. The first payment cost him his boat. The next would cost him even more. By the time the last payment cleared, nearly a year later, the silence in my life felt lighter than the chaos ever had. Dad barely looked at me at gatherings. Claire still muttered sharp comments, but they carried more bitterness than power. Mom tried guilt, but her words slid off me like rain on glass. Grandpa, though, he treated me differently. "About time you stopped carrying their weight," he said, handing me the keys to one of his rentals. Not a burden, a partnership. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that drained me lost my trust. The one man I once feared now trusted me with his legacy. I rebuilt, opened a safe deposit box. No more hiding cash under mattresses. No more lying awake, wondering when the next emergency would strip me bare. The truth is, I didn't just get $25,000 back. I got clarity. That my peace is worth more than their approval. That saying no doesn't make me cold. It makes me free. Now, when my phone lights up with Dad's name, I don't feel my stomach knot. I know the answer before the ask. No, not angry, not guilty. Just a boundary, clear and final. So here's my message. You're not wrong for saying no. You're not cruel for setting limits. Family isn't defined by who takes from you. It's defined by who respects you. If you've ever had to choose between peace and family approval, you know how heavy that feels. But choosing yourself is worth it. Your story might not look like mine, but if you've ever whispered no and felt the room turn against you, understand this. You're not alone. Have you ever had to draw that hard line? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know how you found your strength. And if this story spoke to you, subscribe to Echoes of Life for more stories of betrayal, boundaries, and the freedom of saying no. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you'll ever do is simply stop carrying what was never yours.
I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped onto Wall Street in downtown Asheville, the winter air sharp against my skin. The marketplace stood just ahead, its warm glow spilling across the sidewalk. I'd chosen it carefully elegant enough for the occasion, but not ostentatious. Tonight was my father's 60th birthday, and I had planned every detail to make it unforgettable. The hostess led me to the private dining area I had reserved, a corner room with tall brick walls and soft lighting. Fresh flowers were arranged in the center of the long table, the kind Dad liked, deep red carnations mixed with sprigs of pine. I had arrived early, wanting to confirm the wine selection, the dessert, even the placement of the chairs. Everything had to be just right. For years, I had been the one holding this family together, though no one seemed to notice. From my small apartment in Charlotte, I had wired money for medical bills, truck repairs, tuition, even the roof over their heads. I told myself it was love, that giving meant I belonged. But there was always a part of me that wondered if I was simply buying a seat at the table. Tonight, I wanted no doubts. Tonight, my father would smile, my mother would soften, and my brothers would remember I was more than the sister who wrote checks. I wanted us to feel like a family again, even if it was only for a few hours. I slipped the small velvet box from my purse and placed it discreetly beside my plate. Inside was the watch Dad had once admired through a store window, its navy face shining under the lights. It had cost more than I'd budgeted, but I didn't care. He deserved something beautiful after the year he'd endured. As I adjusted the silverware one final time, I heard laughter echoing from the restaurant entrance. My family had arrived, and with them, the beginning of a night I would never forget. Growing up in Asheville meant that my world stretched from the Blue Ridge Parkway to the cracked sidewalks of our neighborhood, but inside our house, it revolved around my 2 brothers. Julian, 3 years older, was the golden boy, tall, broad-shouldered, and gifted on the football field. He carried my mother's pride like a crown. She bragged about his touchdowns to anyone who would listen, as if his victories belonged to her. Then there was Damon, 2 years younger, quick-witted, and endlessly forgiven. He had a way of turning mistakes into stories that made everyone laugh. Teachers overlooked his half-finished homework, and my mother excused every late night and broken rule with a shake of her head and a soft smile. And me, I was simply Celine. Quiet, bookish, more at home in the library than on the field or stage. My report cards came back with perfect grades, but my achievements always seemed to earn faint praise compared to my brothers. "She's smart," my mother would say, "but not a natural leader like Julian." Or, "She's focused, but Damon has such charm." Each qualifier left its mark. When the recession hit in 2008, I was 15. I watched my parents whisper over bills at the kitchen table, my father's hands rough and restless from construction jobs that no longer paid enough. My mother's face grew lined with worry. That was the year I stopped dreaming small. While Julian talked about scholarships and Damon drifted toward music, I decided I would study finance. Numbers, at least. Couldn't play favorites. I started working part-time at a diner after school, saving every dollar. I believed that if I could help carry the weight that pressed on our family, maybe then I'd finally be more than just the overlooked daughter. The sound of footsteps approaching the restaurant table brought me back to the present, and I braced myself as my family filled the room. At UNC Chapel Hill, I thought I had finally stepped into a life of my own. I had earned a scholarship that covered tuition and books, and between tutoring economics freshmen and interning at a local investment firm, I kept myself afloat. My roommates spent weekends at Franklin Street bars, but I worked late shifts in the library, convincing myself that discipline was the key to freedom. The first call came during my junior year. My father's truck, the one he relied on for construction jobs, had broken down. The repair shop in Asheville quoted $500, money he didn't have. "It's okay if you can't," he said over the phone, but I wired the money that same night, skipping textbooks I had planned to buy. 2 months later, Mom called about an unexpected medical bill. This time, it was $300. "We'll pay you back," she promised. They never did. Then Damon needed tuition for community college, $2,000 to keep him enrolled. I covered that too, telling myself family came first. By senior year, nearly half my internship salary was being sent back home. After graduation, when I landed a financial analyst job in Charlotte with a solid starting salary, I thought things might settle. Instead, the requests multiplied. When Dad's chest pains led to surgery, the bills were staggering. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. I emptied my savings, nearly $18,000, and still took out a personal loan. Later, I helped with the mortgage $12,000 spread over 2 years to keep them from defaulting. Add to that Damon's tuition and Julian's truck when it was repossessed, and I barely noticed how quickly the numbers added up. I lived in a studio apartment furnished with second-hand chairs, drove a Honda on its last legs, and bought groceries in bulk to stretch each paycheck. Meanwhile, family dinners and new household appliances appeared whenever I visited Asheville. I told myself it was temporary, that my sacrifices meant I was needed, maybe even loved. But in truth, I had become something else entirely, the family ATM. The hum of conversation in the marketplace dimmed when my family entered. Coats brushed with cold air from the street. I rose to greet them, hugging Dad first. He looked healthy, the color back in his cheeks after last year's surgery. His blazer, the one I'd bought him for Christmas, sitting neatly on his shoulders. For a moment, that sight alone made every sacrifice feel worth it. We settled around the table, menus passed, candles flickering against the brick walls. The server brought the Cabernet I'd requested, and Dad's eyes lit up when he recognized the label. "My favorite," he said, clapping my shoulder. I smiled, saying nothing about the $80 price tag. Tonight wasn't about numbers. When the time for gifts came, I waited until the others had gone first. Julian handed over a polo shirt and woodworking book. Damon slid across a framed fishing photo from last summer. Both gifts were simple, thoughtful in their way, and Dad thanked them warmly. Then I reached for the velvet box at my side. "This one's from me," I said, sliding it across the linen. Dad opened it slowly. And when the Omega Seamaster caught the light, his breath caught too. It was the same watch he'd once admired in the window of a shop at Biltmore Village, pausing just long enough for me to remember. "Celine," he whispered, his voice thick. His eyes shone as I helped fasten the strap around his wrist. "It's perfect." For that brief second, I felt I belonged. But as I looked up, Julian's smile was tight, his eyes fixed on the watch with a shadow I knew too well. Damon let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That must have cost a fortune," he muttered. "Half a joke, half something else." Across the table, Mom's expression hardened, her lips pressed together, and I saw in her eyes not pride, not gratitude, but something colder, sharper, waiting for its turn to surface. The first comment slid out so smoothly I almost convinced myself I had misheard it. We had just ordered appetizers when Mom leaned back in her chair, smiling tightly as the server walked away. "Not everyone can afford places like this," she said, her eyes landing on me. "But I suppose when you're single with no responsibilities, it's easy to be generous." Julian chuckled, raising his glass. Damon joined in with a low laugh, as though it were all a harmless joke. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but forced myself to take a sip of wine instead of responding. Dad tried to redirect the moment, recalling one of his old job sites, but before long, Mom struck again. "Celine, you must be logging 60-hour weeks to keep up with your lifestyle. No wonder you don't have time for real life." She paused, letting the words linger like smoke. "Some people can be so obsessed with money, they forget about warmth." Julian leaned toward Damon. "Remember how she used to make spreadsheets for her allowance," he said, laughing. "She was 10 going on 40. Damon grinned. "Still is. Only now the spreadsheets are probably for her bank account." I pressed my hands together under the table, nails biting into my palms. Dad cleared his throat and spoke louder than necessary about his favorite woodworking project, but his voice faded beneath their laughter. The memory of my recent breakup flickered in my mind, and before I could shake it off, Mom delivered the next blow. Marcus was right. You know, a man doesn't want to compete with numbers and deadlines forever. The words cut deeper than she could have imagined. The breakup was still raw, and hearing his name, turned into a weapon at this table, left me dizzy. The candles flickered against the brick walls, shadows stretching across their faces. I wondered if anyone else at the restaurant could sense the shift at our table, the subtle cruelty disguised as banter, the easy way my family turned me into a punchline. Each laugh from my brothers, each sideways glance from my mother, felt like another incision. And as I sat there smiling tightly, swallowing back the sting, I knew the cuts were beginning to draw blood. By the time entrees were cleared, I felt like I had been through a dozen small battles. My father tried valiantly to keep the mood afloat, sharing stories from his younger years. But each time I spoke, my mother found a way to twist it into something sharp. When I mentioned a recent promotion, she smiled with false sweetness. Of course Celine's moving up. She always knows how to buy affection. The words landed like a slap. My fork hovered in the air, the taste gone from my mouth. Julian and Damon chuckled uneasily, avoiding my eyes while Dad shook his head. "Aurelia, enough. This is supposed to be a celebration." But Mom wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her wine glass balanced delicately in her hand. "It's true, Robert. All these grand gestures, the expensive dinners, the flashy watch. Celine's always been good at throwing money around. She thinks that makes her important." A dry laugh escaped her lips. And then, as if the moment demanded cruelty, she added, "But it doesn't matter what she buys. She's not even part of this family." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The clatter of dishes and hum of conversation from the dining room beyond seemed to stop at the door. Even the waiter carrying a tray paused, uncertain whether to approach. The sentence echoed in my mind, the words unraveling the years of sacrifice I had carried like armor. I stared at my mother, at the triumphant tilt of her chin, and then at my father. He looked stricken, caught between loyalty and disbelief. Julian shifted in his seat, suddenly fascinated with his glass of water. Damon's smirk faltered into something closer to fear. My hands trembled beneath the table, but I kept my face still, my breath even. Inside, something cracked open, a quiet rupture that I knew could never be mended. I reached for my wine, lifting the glass with a steadiness that surprised even me. The room seemed to tilt, every eye fixed on me, waiting to see if I would cry, argue, or flee. Instead, I smiled faintly, the stem of the glass cool against my fingers, and prepared to speak. I lifted my glass, the stem steady in my hand, though my pulse hammered in my ears. My mother's smirk lingered, but I could see curiosity flicker in her eyes when I finally spoke. "Perfect," I said evenly, my voice clear enough to carry down the table. "Then don't ask me for any more money." The words fell into the silence like a stone. For once, no one laughed. I set the glass back on the table, folding my hands. Let's be honest. Shall we $18,000 for Dad's surgery? $12,000 to cover the mortgage over the last 2 years. $8,000 when Julian's car was repossessed. $6,000 for Damon's tuition that he never finished. $4,000 for the new roof. $3,000 for the furnace repair last winter. I watched the numbers land, one by one, each heavier than the last. Damon's grin slipped into something hollow, and Julian's shoulders sagged as he stared at the tablecloth. My father looked as though I had struck him, his eyes wide and searching. "And tonight," I added, gesturing to the plates, "the wine, the flowers, $350 for this dinner, all so Dad could celebrate with the people he loves. Paid for by the daughter who apparently isn't even part of this family." My mother's face shifted in an instant, triumph draining into panic. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She hadn't expected me to say it aloud, to reveal the quiet ledger I had carried for years. The silence around us deepened. Even the children stopped fidgeting, sensing something irreversible. I lifted my glass again, took a slow sip, and set it down without breaking eye contact. The truth was finally on the table, and there was no taking it back. The waiter approached cautiously, glancing between me and my family as if weighing how to step into the tension. I slid my credit card from its folder and placed it firmly in his hand. "Actually," I said, keeping my tone calm, "bring me a separate check, just mine." My father's head snapped up. "Celine, don't." But I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the waiter until he nodded and disappeared toward the register. The silence that followed was unbearable, punctured only by the clink of Julian setting down his fork too hard. Damon muttered something under his breath, but I didn't bother to ask what. When the slip arrived, I signed it quickly, leaving a generous tip. My share, my dinner, my wine, nothing more. I stood, slinging my purse over my shoulder, and let my gaze sweep across the table one last time. Their faces looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth they had tried to bury. Outside, the air bit against my skin, the Asheville night sharp and clear. I walked past the Art Deco storefronts of Pack Square, the cool light from the street lamps throwing long shadows across the brick. Relief seeped into me with each step. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for holding anyone together. By the time I reached Charlotte, my phone was buzzing relentlessly. Voicemails stacked up, Dad pleading for me to call back, Julian insisting we could fix things, Damon half joking but with panic in his voice. I listened to none of them. Then came the final message. My mother's voice, thick but steady. "Celine, I shouldn't have said what I did, but you can't just walk away. We can't keep up the mortgage without your help. Your father's medical bills aren't finished. The credit cards are maxed. You know we need you." I let the phone fall silent on the counter, her words echoing louder than the others. It wasn't love she was reaching for. It was survival. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. At first, the messages came daily. Dad explaining they were short on the mortgage. Julian confessing that he had hidden their financial dependence from his wife. Damon admitting he'd been evicted and was sleeping on a friend's couch. Each call ended the same way with some version of "we need you," but I didn't pick up. I couldn't. For once, I chose myself. I booked a solo trip to Maui, something I'd put off for years because there was always another bill, another crisis. The sound of waves against black rock cliffs, the scent of plumeria, the sunsets spilling across the Pacific. Everything felt like it belonged only to me. I read novels on the beach, let the sun soak into my skin, and felt my shoulders finally loosen. Back in Charlotte, I returned to work sharper, more focused. My boss noticed, praising my energy, handing me new projects I would have been too drained to accept before. I also began therapy, where I said aloud things I had never dared, that I had been buying love, that my family had mistaken sacrifice for duty. Meanwhile, without me, they began to adjust. Dad picked up consulting work, old contacts in construction calling him for advice. Julian, pressed by his wife, finally set up a budget and stuck to it. Damon found a full-time job, trading late nights for steady pay. They weren't thriving, but they were surviving, and for once, I wasn't the net beneath them. Sitting in my apartment one evening, suitcase still half unpacked from Hawaii, I realized I was free. For the first time in years, my life was truly my own. A year passed before I set foot in Asheville again. The call had come from Dad. Mom had suffered a mild heart attack. It wasn't life-threatening, but it forced a pause, a reckoning. Weeks later, I received a letter in her handwriting. 5 pages of raw confession. She admitted her jealousy, her bitterness, the way my independence had made her feel small. Instead of being proud, she wrote, "I resented you. I punished you for succeeding where I felt I had failed." I read it 3 times before I believed it. Time and therapy had softened her, made her words different, less sharp, more human. She didn't ask for money, only the chance to try again. So when Dad turned 61, I agreed to come. We gathered once more at the marketplace, the same restaurant where everything had broken apart. But this time, there were no jabs, no tight smiles. When the bill came, Julian slid his card in first. Damon handed over cash. Dad added what he could. I paid my share. No more, no less. For the first time, I wasn't carrying anyone. As the glasses rose in a toast, I caught Mom's gaze across the table. Her smile was tentative but real. And for once, I didn't search it for hidden barbs. Dad raised his voice above the clink of silverware. "To family," he said. I lifted my glass with the rest, but the word felt different on my tongue. I wasn't part of this family because of what I provided. I was part of it because I demanded to be seen, to be respected, to be loved for who I was. In the end, what makes you family the money you give, or the love you refuse to sell? I had lived in that house for 25 years, long after most people my age had built families or careers of their own. At first, it was necessity, my father's back injury, my mother's declining health, bills that stacked higher than we ever expected. I stayed, and then the years just kept folding in on each other. Somewhere along the way, my life became about preserving theirs. I paid the utilities when work was scarce for them, kept the mortgage current when emergencies drained our accounts, and did the kind of invisible labor no one praises but everyone relies on. I painted the porch each spring, patched the roof after storms, clipped the hedges until the neighbors joked they could set their watches by me. Sacrifice had become habit, and habit eventually felt like obligation. That evening, we were in the dining room, the one I had repainted in soft blue when I was 23. My mother set her fork down, folded her hands, and said evenly, "Corinne, it's time you found your own place." My father nodded, not meeting my eyes, as if the decision had been rehearsed. The words were sharp and flat, slicing through decades of unspoken expectation. I thought I might cry or plead or shout. Instead, I laughed. The sound startled even me, short, dry, too brittle to be mistaken for humor. My mother frowned. What's funny? I shook my head, forcing a smile that didn't reach my chest. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. In that strange burst of laughter, I felt something loosen, like a knot that had held me bound for years. They spoke as though I'd overstayed, as though my presence were an inconvenience, not the scaffolding that kept the house upright. They were already imagining the empty bedroom, the redecorated walls, the space they could finally reclaim. Their dismissal stung, but underneath the sting was a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years possibility. Maybe they thought they were pushing me out. Maybe they were. But for the first time, the idea of leaving didn't feel like loss. It felt like a door opening. I excused myself quietly, carried my plate to the sink, and stood there in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were racing. They wanted me gone. Fine. Perhaps it was time I learned what gone could mean. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, the echo of my mother's words replaying over and over, "Find your own place." They made it sound so simple, as if the past 25 years had been a casual arrangement I could just shrug off. When I was 20, I'd planned to move into an apartment with 2 friends from college. My father's accident changed everything. A fall from scaffolding left him unable to work for nearly a year, and the medical bills came faster than the checks. I stayed, telling myself it was temporary, just until he healed. By the time he was back on his feet, my mother's health began to slide. She hid the severity at first, but I noticed the prescriptions, the fatigue, the hospital visits. Someone needed to manage the finances. Someone had to be steady when both of them were slipping. That someone was me. My friends built their lives, marriages, careers, children, while my life narrowed into a routine of responsibility. I told myself loyalty would be rewarded, that someday they'd look at me and see the daughter who had given up everything to hold the family together. But people forget the scaffolding when the building still stands. In recent years, with their health improved, they began to treat me less like the one who held things together and more like a fixture in the house. My father called me comfortable. My mother, on sharper days, called me dependent. The irony was unbearable. I had been the one to keep the mortgage afloat, the utilities paid, the property tended like a shrine. Yet, in their eyes, I was invisible useful until I wasn't replaceable once they decided they wanted something different. That laugh at the dinner table wasn't madness. It was release. It was the sound of chains loosening, of a truth I had refused to admit pressing its way to the surface. If they didn't value what I'd given, then maybe it was time I stopped offering it so freely. And with that thought, the possibility of leaving began to take shape. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the stack of envelopes I kept tucked in a drawer. Bills, bank statements, tax records, all the proof of the life I had carried on my shoulders. For years I had opened them quietly, paid what needed to be paid, and slipped them back without ceremony. My parents never asked, and I never offered. It had become routine. But this time I pulled everything out and spread it across the table. The mortgage statements bore my name, not theirs. My grandfather had arranged it that way, transferring the deed to me in his will when I was barely 20. He said once, in a hushed voice, that he wanted me to have something of my own because he feared my parents would take too much. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now, I understood. I flipped through my savings account records, investments my grandfather had started for me, modest but steady. Over the years, I had added bits when I could, small deposits that had grown in the background while I worked and saved. On my laptop, I searched the property value. My breath caught when I saw the number. The market had climbed beyond anything I imagined. The house I had been told was not mine to claim was worth over $1 million. I sat back, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound. All these years, I thought I was trapped in obligation, held hostage by loyalty. But the truth was startling. I had been holding the key the whole time. A strange calm settled over me, not fear, not grief, but a steady recognition of power. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the dependent one. I was the owner, the provider, the one with the means to choose. And that choice, once unthinkable, was starting to feel inevitable. I became an actress in my own home. When my mother rattled on about the retirement condos she thought would suit me perfectly, I smiled and nodded as though she had my best interests at heart. When my father bragged to his friends that they would finally get their house back once I moved out, I laughed along like it was a harmless joke. Inside, though, I was already 10 steps ahead of them. The day after I discovered the true value of the property, I reached out to someone I trusted, Mrs. Kellerman, a realtor known for both her skill and her discretion. She had managed a few sales in our neighborhood, always with quiet efficiency, and I knew she wouldn't breathe a word to my parents until I was ready. We met in her office, where the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood made the air feel solid, certain. She reviewed the numbers, scrolling through comparable properties with a look of restrained excitement. "Corinne, if you're serious about selling, you're sitting on a gold mine. This market is moving fast. You'd have buyers lining up immediately." Her words settled into me like an anchor, not weighing me down but steadying me. I asked her to proceed quietly, and she assured me she would. That night, I went through an old box of keepsakes my grandfather had left me. Among the letters and photographs was a postcard of Monaco, its harbor glittering in the Mediterranean sun. On the back, in his careful handwriting, he had written, "Promise me you'll see this place one day. Life is too short to stay in one corner of the world." I traced those words with my fingers, remembering how he used to tell me stories of Europe, of freedom, of beauty that seemed impossible from the confines of our small American town. I never believed I'd go. Now, I could see it clearly. Meanwhile, my parents carried on, oblivious. They gossiped with neighbors about paint colors and furniture sets, about how they would reclaim the space once I finally got out of their way. Their laughter filled the house, certain and smug. I sat among them, quiet, smiling when expected. They thought I was still their dependent daughter, caught under their roof. They had no idea I had already begun tearing the roof away from over their heads. Once I gave Mrs. Kellerman the green light. The process moved faster than I could have imagined. She arranged for a professional stager to come in while my parents were out running errands. I pretended I was reorganizing closets and cleaning carpets so they wouldn't question why strangers came through the door. By the time my parents returned, everything looked almost the same, just a little neater, a little brighter. They didn't notice the subtle touches that would photograph beautifully online. Each evening, my parents would sit in the living room and talk about the big changes they planned for once I finally moved out. My mother wanted to tear down the wallpaper in the dining room, the very one I had chosen and painted years ago. My father mused about knocking down walls for an open floor plan. They spoke like dreamers, blind to the fact that the future they imagined was already slipping away. Within a week, offers began to appear. Mrs. Kellerman sent them over discreetly, each one higher than the last. The market truly was hot, but it wasn't just numbers on paper, there were stories attached. One couple wrote me a letter, explaining how they pictured their children growing up in the backyard, riding bikes on the quiet street, celebrating birthdays in the same dining room my parents had now dismissed as outdated, reading their words. I felt a rush of something I hadn't expected relief. The house deserved to be loved, not resented. I could let it go without bitterness, knowing it was going to people who saw it as a beginning, not a burden. The day I signed the papers, I did it quietly, sitting at Mrs. Kellerman's desk while sunlight streamed through her office window. My hand was steady as I wrote my name. each letter anchoring the choice I had made. When I set the pen down, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel fear. I felt the weight of 25 years finally lift. The house was no longer my cage. It was my liberation. And all that was left was to tell the people who had taken me for granted that they no longer had a home to claim. For weeks, I let them live in their illusion. My mother clipped magazine pages of kitchens she wanted to remodel. My father paced the living room, talking about how the house would finally feel like ours again once I was gone. They thought I was busy searching for a modest apartment, maybe some rented corner to tuck myself into. In truth, I was waiting for the papers to finalize. The morning they arrived, I placed the envelope neatly on the kitchen table. My parents were sipping coffee, the air heavy with their casual chatter about all the changes they'd make. I sat down, calm and deliberate. "You told me to find my own place," I said softly, sliding the envelope toward them. "I did. The house is sold." At first, they laughed, assuming it was some misguided attempt at sarcasm. But when I opened the documents, laying out the deed, the will from my grandfather, and the signed sale agreement, the laughter died. My mother's face drained of color. "What are you talking about? You can't sell our house." I met her gaze steadily. "It was never yours to sell. Grandfather left it to me, and for 25 years I've kept it afloat, paid the bills, fixed the roof, carried the weight. You just never noticed." My father's fist came down hard on the table, rattling the mugs. "This is our home. You've betrayed us." "No," I said, my voice even. "I've freed myself. You pushed me out, and I walked through the door you opened." For once, silence filled the space where their voices had always overpowered mine. They looked at each other, lost, scrambling for words that wouldn't come. The authority they once wielded over me had evaporated. I stood, pulling 2 suitcases from beside the door. They were already packed documents, essentials, the life I had chosen. I placed a final note on the table, the buyer's move-in date, clear and final. Their eyes followed me as I walked toward the door, but they didn't call me back. For the first time, they couldn't. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and with that simple act, I left more than a house. I left the chains of their control, stepping into the future I had already claimed. At the airport, I moved through the terminal with only 2 suitcases, a folder of legal documents, and the wired funds from the sale sitting safely in my account. For years, I had carried the weight of an entire household, but now my life fit into luggage I could roll behind me. It was almost laughable, the difference between what I thought I needed and what I truly did. On the plane, I sat by the window, watching the city I had never really left shrink beneath the wings. My parents had believed they held the power, that I was tethered to their approval, dependent on their permission to exist. They were blind to the truth I had always had independence within reach, only hidden under years of sacrifice. Their ultimatum hadn't broken me, it had revealed me. Hours later, when the clouds finally parted, Monaco came into view. The coastline shimmered like a secret revealed, sunlight bouncing off the water until it looked like glass. The city rose against the mountains, elegant and untouchable, as though it had been waiting all along for me to arrive. I felt no fear stepping off the plane, no ache of leaving behind the familiar. Instead, there was a stillness inside me, a quiet assurance that I had made the right choice. The apartment I had arranged was small compared to the house I had left, but it overlooked the Mediterranean, and the view alone felt like a rebirth. That first night, I stood on the balcony, the air carrying salt and warmth, the sea moving steadily below. For the first time in 25 years, I belonged to no one but myself. And with that realization, I knew the life I had postponed for decades was finally beginning. The mornings in Monaco became my sanctuary. I would wake to the sound of gulls circling the harbor, step onto my terrace with a cup of strong coffee, and watch the sun spread gold across the Mediterranean. The air was softer here, warmer somehow, as though it had been waiting to soothe me after years of gray obligation. I began learning French, stumbling through simple greetings with shopkeepers, repeating phrases to myself until they felt natural on my tongue. The markets were vibrant rows of olives, fresh bread, flowers bursting with color. Neighbors greeted me kindly, curious but welcoming, as if I had always belonged on these narrow streets. For the first time in decades, each day felt like discovery rather than duty. I carved out hours for something I had abandoned long ago: photography. I bought a new camera and wandered the city, capturing light on water, the lines of boats against the horizon, the easy smiles of strangers. Slowly, an idea grew. I could turn this passion into a business: portraits and prints, perhaps even exhibitions. My funds gave me security, but it was this pursuit that gave me purpose. The letters and calls began within weeks. At first, my parents were furious, demanding explanations, accusing me of betrayal. Later, their tone softened, shifting to pleading, reminding me of memories from childhood, begging for another chance. When silence followed, I felt no panic. Their voices had dictated the rhythm of my life for 25 years, but now they were only echoes, fading further each day. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Their words no longer carried weight. They could not reach me across the sea. Standing on my terrace one evening, camera in hand, I realized I had not just left a house behind. I had left an old version of myself, and in its place, something entirely new was beginning. Months passed, and my life settled into a rhythm that felt wholly mine. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, my phone lit up with a number I knew by heart. My mother's voice came through, thinner than I remembered. "Corinne, we're struggling. Things aren't easy without you here. Maybe we were too harsh. Maybe we shouldn't have said what we did. Just come back, please." Her words hung in the air, fragile and searching. I listened, letting the silence stretch. Once, I would have rushed to fill it, to reassure, to carry their burdens without question. But now, I felt only a quiet clarity. "I hear you," I said gently. "I hope you find your place. I've found mine." There was a pause, a sharp inhale on the other end, and then nothing more. I ended the call, placing the phone face down on the table. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't ache. The cycle that had bound me for so long was broken, not with anger, but with release. I stepped out onto my terrace, the evening breeze carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and rose, the kind of sunset that made the world feel endless. I lifted a glass of wine, holding it toward the horizon. "After 25 years," I whispered to myself, "I didn't just find my own place. I found myself." The sea stretched out before me, vast and unclaimed, and I knew that from this moment on, every step forward belonged only to me.